This is Chtonia, the world of the dark feminine. I'm pleased to introduce the first new Chtonia book's title in almost 4 years, Project Lethe. This book brings back some of the characters from my earlier novel, The Morrigan Timelines, and centers around a young woman named Sydney Duncan who loses her memory under mysterious circumstances, and is able to start a whole new life with her boyfriend, Mark Ryland, in which she is very happy. A chance meeting with someone from her past unravels her new life, testing her relationship with Mark and forcing her to confront a truly horrific past. Project Lethe is now available on Amazon and can be ordered in any bookstore. Visit chtonia.net/publications for details on this book and other Chtonia titles. Hello, this is Breach Burke. Before we get into this week's podcast, I would like to thank my patrons personally: Gwyn K., Politi, John H., Tanya T., Veronica S., Jeffrey B., Gabby, Helen M., Sunny H., Scott K., JRM, Susie G., Eldritch Priest, B. Lupita, C. Roberts, Jeanette, DS, Jake B., CDV, Ali, Thaddeus G., V! V, Marybeth R., Ida B., Eric N., and Tana. I really appreciate those of you who have joined recently and who have stuck with me over these years. Our community is small, and there is so much I would like to do in terms of providing courses, conversation on the dark feminine, and extra content, so please consider joining at patreon.com/Chtonia. Now on to the podcast. Hello and welcome to Chtonia, the podcast dealing with the dark feminine. I'm your host, Breach Burke, and this week we are going to talk about something that is known as an architectural grotesque. It is a feature that you will find on cathedrals, castles, other buildings, particularly from the medieval period onward, and this is the figure known as the Sheela Na Gig. The actual meaning of the name, it's not entirely clear what the meaning is exactly. Definitely it carries the connotation of an sort of an old hag or an old woman showing her vulva, is what she's doing, and that's the thing. I'm just looking at the etymology of the name. It said it was first published as a local name for a carving presented on a church gable wall in Rochestown, County Tipperary in Ireland. And it was, they said, scholars disagree about the origin and meaning of the name. It is not directly translatable to Irish, in spite of the Irish sound of it. So if it's according to the Oxford English Dictionary, they say it's derived from Irish, the Julia of the breasts, which is I'm not going to try to read the Irish name for that, but basically it's usually used as a term for a hag or an old woman. Okay. Now, the way that these figures present themselves, and if you're watching this on YouTube, obviously there will be some of these images presented there. They've been found on churches probably. I think they were saying that the first ones that were ever seen, they're listed as being a medieval feature from churches, basically from the Norman, from both the Norman and on the, really, as they said, Romanesque kind of churches. So looking at SheelaNaGig.org, which is actually a site that looks at the sightings of these particular features and where they appear. And they said usually it's very likely that the Sheela comes from they're talking about a 12th century, they're talking about a particular carving here, 12th century chapel. Basically what I've seen from what I've read through here is we're looking at something from the 11th or 12th century is what we're looking at with the Sheela Na Gig. So it's not something, so we're not looking at a particular type of carving that's really, really ancient in the sense of belonging to, say, the Celts or the pre-Celtic peoples or anything like that. Now, the thing is, and I'm saying Celtic here only because there's a huge number of them that are found in Ireland, but Ireland is by no means the only place where they're found. They're also found in Great Britain, they're also found in France and in Spain, and sometimes they're seen together with male figures. And as we know, churches, very elaborate churches and cathedrals, And even castles might have these kinds of figures. You see gargoyles and things, for instance, that are carved on churches. You'll see green men that are carved on these as well. And particularly those two figures, which are not, by the way, related, in spite of the fact that you might think that they are related, being that they both appear to have something to do with sexuality. There's not necessarily a connection between the two. It's not like, they're not a matched pair or anything like that. But the fact that these appear on this cathedral architecture and on castle architecture in particular, and in a few other places as well, it's really rather curious. So rather really than get into the history of the architecture per se, what I want to do is talk about them as the figure itself and what it might represent. Now I'm saying might because the real answer here is we don't actually know what they mean. There are a number of theories and a number of guesses as to what the Sheela Na Gig represents. And there are some connections that could probably be made in terms of the archetypal symbolism, because what we focus on in this podcast is what are we looking at archetypally? What does this figure point to, regardless of maybe what the intention was of the carver? Certainly, we want to take into account any folklore that was around in that particular region. The fact that it appears in places throughout Europe does almost suggest an idea that these might be Celtic, but it doesn't. I don't know that's necessarily proven that that's the case. And the thing is that the other thing that's been questioned is whether or not it relates to earlier female figures that are known for exposing themselves, such as Baubo, for instance, in the story of Demeter and Persephone in the ancient Greek. I've even seen Barbara Walker try to liken the Baubo and such similar figures, or actually the Sheela Na Gig figure itself, she likened that to goddess Kali in some way, and I thought, well, I think Barbara Walker is one of the few people who puts a link between Kali and the Kyloch of the Ireland, the hag figure of Ireland, and I think it's a rather tenuous link. I've only heard one other person tell me that this link might have some merit to it. Somebody whose scholarship I do respect, but at the same time, I'm like, I don't know. That to me, I mean, again, we can look at the whole Indo-European language thing and how languages have spread and how peoples have spread and the way migrations are. Is it impossible that there's a connection? It's not impossible. It just seems like any link still seems like pretty much of a stretch. So, and to me, I think the idea is that because Kali can sometimes make some very grotesque faces and have some grotesque ways in which she presents herself, that there may be some similarities in the symbolism, although I don't think that what Kali represents is the same thing as what a Sheela Na Gig, presuming that we're looking at a female hag figure that is basically that is deliberately being lewd, I guess is the word that you would use. That I think the actual action of the figure is what's more important here than whatever other connections there might be. Obviously, in different cultures, when you're looking at archetypal symbolism, you're going to find a representation that might be similar. It might mean exactly the same thing. It might not, but we definitely get a sense of the archetype and what it might mean. Now, I'm just going to mention here that as part of this, we're going to think a little bit about the connection of the feminine to the devil and the idea of the devil. And I'm just going to mention that this is actually going to be a special podcast that I do. As I was working on this, there's so much side material on that I thought, you know what, that would be a good podcast for Patreon. So if you're not a Patreon member, you might want to consider subscribing if you want to get some of these extra episodes, because that's the topic that I think I would like to cover. Sometimes I cover them on live streams on Instagram, but I feel like that one requires a little more research, and I think I'm going to do that one more for the Cattonia audience on Patreon at the $5 tier and above. They usually get extra podcasts, so that's going to be a topic for there. But so we're going to dive in here and talk about the Sheela Na Gig in terms of what this means, what the theories are about what it means. And then I want to look at it. I want to look at figures like Baubo and see how she compares, again, even though not For those who are going to jump and say, there's no connection between the two. Yes, I know there's no connection between the two. I mean, there's certainly no proven connection between the two, or any reason to necessarily think that they are the same. But I still do want to talk about what the exaggerated feminine figure might mean. And of course, probably this means that I'm going to be ending with, we're always going to go Jungian here, I'm going to be ending a little bit with Erich Neumann and what he says about, he doesn't say specifically about Sheela Na Gigs, but what he says about exaggerated feminine figures in terms of the Great Mother archetype. Okay, so, all right, so let's start and talk about it. As I mentioned, I gave you the little definition here. Like I said, greatest concentrations of Sheela Na Gigs, figurative carving of a naked woman displaying an exaggerated vulva. And usually there's a pair of hands. The face sometimes could be laughing or leering. Sometimes it has a really funny looking grin on it. I mean, they're comical in a way too. They're grotesque, but in a funny kind of a way. So it would be like if somebody lifted their skirt up, put their hands inside their vagina, and then just pulled it open, and then like made a face at you. That's really what they're represented. And because of the name, which seems to infer someone who's a crone or a hag, this is the idea of the old woman who does that. Which is why I think Baubo is recalled, because that's what she does. She's an old Norman, a nursemaid. When Demeter comes and she won't eat, she's very sad because she's trying to find her daughter and she refuses food. Then Baubo goes and does exactly that thing. She lifts her skirts up, she pulls her, exposes her. Actually, she exposes her genitals and then and makes these funny faces, and that makes Demeter laugh out loud. And so it kind of breaks the thing, and then she eventually does take food. So there's probably something connected to the symbolism there, even if I'm not, again, these are not Baubo figures. They're not meant to be Baubo figures. But Greece does have their own set of Baubo figures that have appeared also in different places. And I have a separate podcast on Baubo, so I'm not going to delve into her iconography here. But these figures nonetheless are interesting, and the fact that they're often on churches is also interesting as well, which has led to a variety of theories here. Now, just looking at, I have a few sites that I've looked at for this. Like I said, the Sheela Na Gig project is a good central resource, not only about the actual architecture itself, but about a lot of the theories connected to it, where they try to get the information together and, bibliographies of books and different resources. So Sheela Na Gig, SheelaNagig, one word.org, is a good place if you're looking for some resources on this particular figure. So, okay, so let's start with the origins of these figures. I am going to look a little bit at Wikipedia here because there is kind of a good executive summary that we're going to refer to but then jump off from. And so it says, okay, for the origins. Scholars disagree about the origins of the figures. James German and Anthony Weir believe the Sheela Na Gigs were first carved in France and Spain during the 11th century. The motif eventually reached Britain and then Ireland in the 12th century. Okay, so that's their theory. German and Weir's work was a continuation of research begun by Jorgen Andersen, who wrote The Witch on the Wall. Okay, which seems to be this is another. That's I think that's the first book to seriously study the Sheela Na Gigs. Eamon Kelly, keeper of Irish antiquities at the National Museum of Ireland in Dublin, draws attention to the distribution of Sheela Na Gigs in Ireland to support Weir and German's theory. Almost all of the surviving in situ Sheela Na Gigs are found in areas of Anglo-Norman conquest, which would be the 12th century. So that does imply that there's something that comes out of France rather than something that originated in Ireland. The areas which remain governed by native Irish have few Sheela Na Gigs. Weir and German also argue that their location on churches and the grotesque features of the figures by medieval standards suggest they represented female lust as hideous and sinfully corrupting. Okay, so that's one of the theories that we're going to get into. Another theory, espoused by Joanne McMahon and Jack Roberts, is the carvings are remnants of a pre-Christian fertility or mother goddess religion. They note what they claim are differences of materials and styles of some Sheela Na Gigs from their surrounding structures, and noting that some are turned on their side to support the idea that they were incorporated from previous structures into early Christian buildings. So that's interesting too. The idea that gives them a kind of pagan flavor. You know what I mean? The idea that they might have been incorporated from earlier buildings onto a church. Now, again, we don't actually know this, but yeah, that's their idea, that these are actually where they come from, that they may have been part of something earlier. Of course, we also have to remember that when we're talking about pre-Christian fertility religions or mother goddess religions, we're not talking about, I guess there could be a temple, but we were not necessarily talking about temples to the ancient mothers. Were not, especially not in that area, were not probably not places that were carved in the way that churches were. You know what I mean? It wasn't the same kind of, you don't find mother goddess temples with that kind of architecture in that part of the world. So, at least not really ancient ones. Certainly there have been temples and there have been things, but I don't think that they would have necessarily had carvings like this of any type. So anyway, so we've talked a bit about the name, and like I said, the name is not, it's not clear, other than that, I think for our purposes, the fact that it refers to a hag figure, and that there seems to be something, so it says, somebody wrote that the term Sheela Na Gig has no etymological meaning and is an absurd name. This is from the Royal Anthropological Institute of Great Britain and Ireland. And Anderson, Weir, and German, and Freitag all dismiss the name as being modern and somewhat arbitrary. So, yeah, so the origin of the name, it seems to be a more modern appellation for these figures, which are called all kinds of different things. And again, you can check out the Sheela Na Gig project. They do actually list the way that these figures are referred to in many different places. Okay, so let's look at the hypotheses here. So the first one we're talking about here is that the Sheela Na Gig is a survival of a pagan goddess, and I'll just read this directly to you. A popular hypothesis is Sheela Na Gigs represent a pagan goddess, but academics believe the situation was more complex, with multiple interpretations and roles for the female character as spiritual traditions changed over time. The goddess in question is usually identified as Celtic, the hag-like Cailleach figure of Irish and Scottish mythology. Margaret Murray proposed this, as did Anne Ross, who wrote in her essay, The Divine Hag of the Pagan Celts. I would like to suggest that in their earliest iconographic form, they do in fact portray the territorial or war goddess in her hag-like aspect. Okay, this is from... This was Anne Ross saying this. Georgia Rhodes suggests the figure may represent the crone or an earth goddess from Celtic mythology. Okay, that's something we have to be careful of right off the bat, because when we start talking about Celtic mythology and what Celtic mythology means, it's very, very tricky. There's a lot of modern reinterpretation of what we think the ancients thought of or what they meant. And the idea, certainly, yes, there is definitely a crone or hag figure that's either the Cailleach, or we see Garavogue, certainly in Irish literature. And this divine hag figure appears in different forms in other cultures as well, maybe not with always the same connotations. Margaret Murray is somebody you have to take with a grain of salt, and in terms of her conclusions about the history of things, in terms of her anthropology. Merch Eliad's Encyclopedia of Religion from 1993 draws parallels between the Sheela Na Gig and the ancient Irish myth of the goddess who granted kingship. Okay, so in this one, Eliad is trying to connect the myths of the Loathly Lady, which I have talked about before. I did a podcast on Dame Ragnell, who's the Arthurian example of the Loathly Lady. So it's the hag who offers herself sexually, and generally she's refused by men because they consider her unattractive. But then when somebody actually takes her up on her offer, she turns into a beautiful maiden. So that's a motif, and it's the Arthurian example is probably the most prominent one, but there are other ones. Now, Anderson devotes a chapter called to this theory entitled Pagan or Medieval. While suggesting possible pagan influences on Irish Sheela Na Gigs, he considers them as having a medieval context. He argues that pagan origins are less likely than influence from the continent during the medieval period. What can be said against it is that it is less easily proved and can less easily be illustrated than the possible continental French origin for the motif discussed earlier in that book. And that book, of course, was The Witch on the Wall. And Weir and German explore the possibility of Baubo, but they acknowledge that it is a tenuous link, but symbolically, and I've talked about that. Okay, and Freitag explores possible Celtic pagan origins, but finds little to suggest a link. In particular, the notion of the divine hag being a portrayal of an Sheela has to be firmly dismissed as a wayward conjecture. Okay, so yeah, but there's still people who want to believe that. But so the idea is we think about, if we think about the way in which Christianity was assimilated through cultures, and we think about the fact that in most cultures, again, whether the female mother is primary or not is it's up. I still feel like that's something that's up for debate. A lot of people have tried to bring Gimbutas back to my attention and say, no, you need to really reconsider this more seriously. And, again, that is something that will at some point do and reread it and try to reevaluate what I think about her. I mean, because I've evaluated Gimbutas in light of the criticism of her. But that said, I still, regardless of what the truth is, and really the bottom line is, even if we talk about these ancient Earth Mother cults, and that there was the idea that these were primary and that there were no male deities, or, until later, or at least that they were more subservient to the female. And my feeling about that is that, even if that were true, okay, if we look at in the cult of Cybele, or we look at the story of Agdistus, we're not talking about something where the Earth Mother is the kind of benign figure that people have portrayed her as. I'm only saying, be careful in your understanding of the Earth Mother, because the Earth Mother, while certainly there is an aspect of femininity that is about, which is loving and nurturing and producing of life and creative, there's also an element of it that is devouring and encompassing and swallowing and just outright destructive, and in terms of the rituals connected to her that can often be bloody, as we've talked about. So regardless of the truth, even if ultimately there was a primal mother, and yes, if that was all the case, I don't know that necessarily we were talking about a peaceful cult that was replaced by these big bad patriarchs. Even though, again, I'm very much against patriarchy, and there's definitely is a patriarchal institution, and things definitely are. That is definitely problematic, and we are getting into a period where that needs to be seriously balanced out. I don't know that I don't know that theory that holds a lot of water about. I think in terms of the evidence, I think that's something that we would like to see, and if it could be potentially interpreted that way, but I don't know that it can definitively be interpreted that way. So anyway, I don't want to diverge in that for too long, but nonetheless, okay. So we have this idea of assimilating when we had sacred wells, and then we had places that were sacred to certain deities, and probably the Great Mother, or some version of the Great Mother, or some feminine deity of the locality, and probably male deities too, were subsumed into the Christian iconography. People might look at the Sheela Na Gig as sort of an extension of that, to say, okay, this is an assimilation here. This is the Sheela Na Gig is on the temple, and this is really just the pagan carryover, just like we see the green men on there. And even gargoyle-like figures, although as those are probably continental as well, coming off of a continental cathedral work. But again, this is why a lot of times they're considered to be Celtic, because the Celts certainly were throughout the all of the continent of Europe, and we always tend to think of Ireland as Celtic, or at least a certain period of its history as Celtic. But the reality is that Celts were in far more than just in Ireland. Okay, so. Let's, and as Barbara Freitag notes, she says, there's probably, it's Celtic pagan origins aren't impossible, but she finds very little to suggest a link between them. So, okay, so let's look at the fertility hypothesis. So we talk about this idea of her being this primeval mother. Now we're looking at the fertility theory, and this is Barbara Freitag. She says that she suggested the figures were used in a fertility context and associates them with birthing stones. There's folkloric evidence of at least some of the Sheela Na Gigs being used in this manner, with the figures being loaned out to women in labor. Okay, so this is an idea that these were some kind of device that women used, or some kind of a totem that people used while they were in labor. Other examples are associated with wedding traditions. And again, Margaret Murray has brought up the figure in the Oxford Church of St. Michael at the North Gate. has an associated tradition of being shown to brides on their wedding day. Okay, so there's a Sheela Na Gig on that church, and that's being shown to brides. So therefore, the idea is that this is something to make the marriage fertile. However, the theory does not seem to apply to all the figures. Some are thin with their ribs showing and thin breasts, which do not suggest fertility. Okay, Eric Neumann has something to say about that, and I'll get to that later. Others are plump and shown in a sexual context with a partner, as at Whittlesford. Teresa Oakley and Alex Woodcock recently discovered an exhibitionist couple at Devizes who seem to represent fertility. The faces of some figures are striated, indicating scarring or tattoos. Weir notes closer examination of the figures reveals functions which are not consistent with the fertility function. Okay. So again, the idea when you're showing a vulva, there definitely seems to be, I would say there has to be something implied about either, about sex in some fashion. Whether or not that has to necessarily be connected to fertility is another matter. We always want to connect sex and fertility because obviously sex is the means of reproduction. Between when you have the male aspect and the female aspect, then this is usually where reproduction takes place. However, as we all know, sex is not necessarily something that is done for those is not. We don't have not everybody. In fact, a lot of people don't have sex with the purpose of having children, and the gestures and so forth. There's almost something, when we talk about something that is lewd, that's typically a phrase that we reserve for pornography. We say that something is pornographic, that means it's lewd, it's obscene, it's something that we shouldn't be looking at, something we don't show to our children, because it exposes something that is dirty, And so when we talk about something that's lewd, we're not necessarily, people don't go out and engage in quote unquote lewd behavior. People don't make pornos so that they can produce children, right? It's not necessarily about fertility. But then there might be the idea that this somehow is connected to that. But so we can look at the other side of this theory, which is the idea that this is a warning against lust. Okay, so that's Weir and German's theory about it. And they see the figures as a religious warning against sins of the flesh. Exhibitionist figures of all types, male, female, and bestial, are found frequently in the company of images of beasts devouring people and other hellish images. These images, they argue, were used as a means of religious instruction to a largely illiterate populace. As part of this interpretation, they explore a continental origin for the figures. Anderson first suggested this origin, and Weir and German continued and expanded this line of inquiry. They argue the motif migrated from the continent via the pilgrim routes to and from the Santiago de Compostela, and Freytag argues against this. Okay. Pilgrim sculptors noted what they had seen on the route and ended up carving their own interpretations of the motifs. Eventually, the exhibitionist motif was transferred to Ireland and Britain. This theory seems to accommodate many of the religious figures, but relates less well to some of the secular ones. Images carved on castles would not be seem to be serving a religious purpose. The figure at Haddon Hall appears on a stable, though this may have been moved from elsewhere. So again, there's no unified theory of what these were for, and when we try to say, this had a religious connotation, this was trying to tell people to avoid sin, or this was a fertility symbol, there's no one figure, there's no one-size-fits-all theory here. These figures, while they're the same, they don't seem to, so far we don't have any kind of one theory that suggests, this is definitely what they were meant for. Okay. Now, the next one would be, this one's interesting, and this is the one that I'm going to talk a little bit about, protection against evil. Okay. So Anderson and Weir and German also think the figures may have been used as protection against evil. This would explain the use of the figures on structures such as castles. They served an apotropaic function designed to ward off evil. In Ireland, some of the figures were called the evil eye stones, which supported their theory. Right, because the evil eye is supposed to protect you from evil, right? Some folkloric evidence is known of anasyrma, is what it's called, which is called skirt lifting, being used by women to ward off evil spirits. Okay, now that's that. Anasyrma is the thing that I was going to talk about here. So I'll finish what they're saying here, and then I'm going to get into that. So they show that there's an illustration from the 18th century by Charles Eisen from La Fontaine's Nouveau Conte, showing a demon being repulsed by the sight of a woman lifting her skirt to display her genitals. Now, we immediately want to stop here and think about this, because the idea that, considering how much we've said about, let's say, the succubus, and everything that the Malleus Maleficarum has said about female lust, sexuality, and its connection to the devil, which is why I want to do a separate podcast on women and the devil, okay, and the connection there. But here we have the opposite assertion, that women in their flaunting their sexuality is actually offensive to the devil. Okay, so this is fascinating. Okay, Were and Germain relate a story from the Irish Times from the 23rd of September 1977, in which a potentially violent incident involving several men was averted by a woman exposing her genitals to them. They doubt, however, whether the story was true. Were and Germain go on to suggest that the apotropaic function seems to have been gradually ascribed to the figures over time. While this theory seems to apply to most of the secular and some of the religious figures, again, it does not apply to all of them. So let me talk about this anasyrma phenomenon here. So I'm gonna read a little bit on an entry connected to this. So it's an ancient Greek word composed of ana, which means up or against, and syrma, which is like a dragging motion. So the idea is it's also called anasyrmos, the plural is anasyrmata, and it's the gesture of lifting the skirt or the kilt. It's used in connection with certain religious rituals, eroticism, and lewd jokes. For example, Baubo, as we had talked about. The term is used in describing corresponding works of art. Anasyrma may be a deliberately provocative self-exposing of one's naked genitals or buttocks. In other words, mooning. And it's interesting when we think about the term mooning. I mean, yes, presumably it's because your buttocks sort of look like that, right? Well, they kind of don't. They kind of do and they kind of don't. But the idea of, being connected to the moon in some way, that's rather interesting. The famous example in the latter case is the Aphrodite Kalapigos, the Aphrodite of the beautiful buttocks. In other contexts, this has an atropaic character, means to ward off a supernatural enemy, or it may be a sign of mockery, analogous to mooning. And so it's interesting, and you will see things like that with the image of the hag who's showing her disdain, by mooning the devil or mooning some demon or something. You see, I have seen representations of this in certain places. So in Greek antiquity, it says ritual jesting and intimate exposure were common in the cults of Demeter and Dionysus, and figure in the celebration of the Eleusinian mysteries associated with these divinities. The mythographer Apollodorus says that Iam's jesting was the reason for the practice of ritual jesting at Thessamorphia, and Iam is another name that we use usually. Usually she's somewhat interchangeable with Baubo, a festival celebrated in honor of Demeter and Persephone. In other versions of the myth of Demeter, the goddess is received by a woman named Baubo, a crone who makes her laugh by exposing herself, a ritual jester called anasyrma. A set of statuettes from Priene, a Greek city on the west coast of Asia Minor, are usually identified as Baubo figurines, representing the female body and as the face conflated with the lower portion of the abdomen. These are counterparts to phalluses decorated with eyes, mouth, and sometimes legs. Okay. Now let's talk about this apotropaic effect. Many historical references suggest that anasyrma had dramatic or supernatural effect, positive or negative. Pliny the Elder wrote that a menstruating woman who uncovers her body can scare away hailstorms. There's a power for you. Whirlwinds and lightning. If she strips naked and walks around a field of wheat, caterpillars, worms, and beetles will fall off the heads. Even when not menstruating, she can lull a storm out at sea by stripping. Such is the power of female sexuality. Little did we know. According to folklore, women lifted their skirts to chase off enemies in Ireland and China. And they mention the story from the Irish Times again. According to Balkan folklore, when it rained too much, women would run into the fields and lift their skirts to scare the gods and end the rain. Maimonides also mentions this ritual to ward off the rain while expressing his disapproval. Stripping away clothes was perceived as creating a raw state closer to nature, than society, facilitating interaction with supernatural entities. In Jean de La Fontaine's Nouveau Conte, yes, we have the demon who is repulsed by the sight of the woman lifting her skirt. And they talk about the Sheela Na Gigs, common in medieval churches in Northern Europe and British Isles. In some nations of Africa, a woman stripping naked and displaying herself is still considered a curse and a means to ward off evil. In Nigeria, during mass protests against the petroleum industry, women displayed themselves in anasyrma. And so, so so there's this idea of female genitalia as somehow warding off evil. Now that's interesting, right? We're looking at all of these examples here. Now, certainly the menstruation aspect, menstruating women are often considered to be unclean, right? That's certainly part of a lot of the rituals. Certain what we see in Judaic rituals, there was a lot about, made about the menstruating woman. And not only in Judaic rituals, we see it in certain tribal rituals where the menstruating woman is kind of put aside. She's kind of it separates herself from the group for a period of time until that period of time is over. And naturally, of course, menstruating, the word menses comes from the idea of month or the idea of the moon cycles. And frequently women who have periods will know that their period is connected to the moon in some way. You're going to find that it comes, first of all, it tends to come around a certain time, perhaps around a full moon or a new moon. Some people's cycles can be more erratic, but you might find it timing. I don't thankfully get them anymore, but they would usually time with some particular part of the moon cycle. Mainly because they come every 28 days if they're regular. And then you might also find, if you're a woman, this is interesting too, if you're a woman working in an office or in a space with other women and you are menstruating, you're still capable of that, then you will find that your cycles will mesh with the cycles of the people that you work with after a while. It's kind of interesting how that works. But interestingly, this idea of exposing oneself or being lewd in some way, again, if you read from what we'd read in the Malleus Maleficarum, like all these kinds of acts of lewdness and fornication and what we think of as even pornographic is something, this whole idea of, these sexually lewd acts were somehow connected to the kinds of things that the devil encouraged you to do. But here, when you have a woman who engages in this behavior herself, somehow that's offensive even to the devil. Which actually, there's sort of an implication there of the devil as the one who wants to maybe control that aspect of sexuality. Although there are certain theories too that the devil actually doesn't want to have sex with women. So interesting things that we see. But this seems to be an ancient idea. The idea of lifting up your skirts and showing off your private bits is somehow something that is considered to be, apotropaic function. That it actually wards evil off. And so that does somewhat seem to support the theory that these Sheela Na Gig figures might be there to ward off evil in some fashion, or warded off from a household. Okay, so there's one other theory with regard to the Sheela Na Gig, and that is what they're talking about here, is this feminist reinterpretation of the image. And rather than read through this, I think the basic thing that we want to get to from this is just the idea of taking a figure that is meant to be, first of all, of a hag. And we've talked about as hags as being considered to be associated with barrenness, but also potentially with sexual experience. I think I did a live stream where I talked a little bit about this, because I was talking about the harpies, I think, as figures. And then I think I went into that in the last live stream that I did. But they're trying to view it as more of an empowering figure, like as women owning their bodies, owning their types of bodies, and owning their own sexual organs as not being something that is shameful, but rather something to be celebrated. Okay, so that's the other take that we see on this figure, or the way people are trying to interpret these figures. Whether or not these are, in the modern times, there's no reason, first of all, why a symbol can't be repurposed for something else. It happens all the time. So the fact that people might repurpose that, to something that is more meant to be more body positive, certainly nothing wrong with doing that. If we're talking about origins, though, it seems to me, when I think about this particular figure, it's I mean, yes, I would imagine its medieval use probably did have something to do with warding off evil. Although, again, we're talking about, because I think one thing that we can see as a carryover, certainly from classical times, classical Greek period and things like that, or even the Roman period, is this idea that well, first of all, there seems to be a kind of sacred significance to the lifting of the skirt, right, as warding off evil. And that seems to have carried over to some degree. But also the fact, if we think about the story of Baubo and Demeter, okay, the fact that she tries to make Demeter laugh by lifting her skirt and making these absurd faces, and that she succeeds in making the Earth Mother stop starving herself and actually eating. There's something there about the way in which in the way in which this allows us to, I don't know, there's a feeling about embracing loss, or embracing sadness, or embracing the suffering of life. Like, there's a playfulness to it. And to me, there's some element there of whether or not life needs to really be taken as seriously as we tend to take it. I mean, we certainly have these mythologies and these beliefs. I mean, life. Okay, let me even back up from that. If you are living in a society that is either a hunter-gatherer society or you're an agrarian society where you're growing crops, okay, if you're doing things like this, then you may be in a place where where obviously your reliance on nature, your whole survival depends on nature, right? It depends on your ability to hunt, your ability to grow crops and to have them live and be, not to get rot or destroyed by rain, or like what the harpies represent, the storm winds and things like that, to not have your livelihood, that food that you need to live that comes from the earth, to be destroyed. So there's a very close connection there between nature and the person. But also, when you look at the exaggerated female figure, if you look at the Sheela Na Gig, that, I mean, and also just has this hilariously wide opening there. I mean, it sometimes it's shown as kind of an upside down triangle. I think Barbara Walker said that the opening of the Sheela Na Gig sometimes looks like a Weskia piscis, which is the vessel of the fish. It's the way those two interlocking circles will come together and they make like a fish image in the middle. And of course, the fish being this symbol of pure selfhood and of the soul. And sometimes people use that as the Christ figure, right? The Christ motif. But you have the Weskia piscis, and also you have the upside down triangle motif, which is another very traditional symbol of the yoni. It's that kind of an opening. And just like the upright triangle tends to represent more masculine energy, the reverse triangle has to do more with feminine energy. And it represents that because also its point points down. It points towards the earth. It doesn't point up. And of course, when we're pointing down, we're making a reference to the earth. We're making a reference to the catonic. And honestly, it feels to me like this is that the fact that you've got this wide opening here, which almost has that vastness of space, or that vastness of possibility that exists in there, and the exaggeration of it really shows, it really emphasizes femininity as possibility, right, as possibility for creation. But also the fact that you're dealing with the mother, the idea of this really, really wide vulva opening has to be, certainly suggests that a lot has passed through it. Okay, shall we say that a lot of, probably a lot of children have passed through this opening, just given the size of it and the way in which she's able to take her hands and open it, but then also making this lewd gesture, and I feel like it's really. There's really something in it about embracing the eroticism of life, and I feel that there's a lot in it that has to do with our connection to the Great Mother archetype. And let me read a little bit from Eric Neumann here. Now, again, this is not specifically on Sheela Na Gigs, and I don't think he's necessarily referring specifically to that figure. In fact, let me move my book here so that I can actually open it. This is my copy of Neumann's The Great Mother is seen better days. So I just want to make sure I open it and can get to the page. Okay, so Neumann is talking in this chapter called The Primordial Goddess in his book, The Great Mother. He talks about the different types of figures and what they look like. Now, again, we're not seeing something that looks specifically like the Sheela Na Gig, but he does talk about figures that maybe have an exaggerated, vulva area, but like some of these Sheela Na Gigs with an emaciated upper body and a lack of breasts. I would remind people about the figure of Chamunda in Hindu mythology. Now, Chamunda is not a fertility figure, okay? She's definitely a more destructive goddess. And she appears in the Devi Mahatmyam as this emaciated figure that grabs the armies of passion and anger, and she swallows them. Now, she never grows any bigger. She still looks like she's starving, but she devours all of these armies. So she becomes a figure that has to do with the calming of passions or the calming of these excessive emotions. She devours them. And when we see these emaciated female figures, Neumann's point in talking about this is people try to treat them as especially the early Great Mother figures that we see, like the Venus of Willendorf, like these things that are like 20,000 years old. I mean, these really old figures that we've seen. And trying to say that these are not meant to be sensual figures. Like, they're not meant to be looked at for the purpose of arousal. Okay, that's not their point. So he talks about I don't know if you say it, Lespugue Venus. He says the upper part of her body has a soulful quality, very different from the exuberant womanhood below. The delicate upper part and the virginal head are bent over a luxurious body bursting with elemental fullness of motherhood. So stressing by a purely stylistic means the contrast between the static elementary character of the mother and the dynamic transformative character of the young woman. Okay, so what he's trying to say is that when you have an upper body that is not developed, or that is one that is, in this case, where the breasts are not exaggerated, or where the upper body is emaciated and it's not voluptuous or full, but the lower part is, there's almost like this idea of looking at the complexity of both the static and dynamic aspects of the Great Mother, in the way in which she represents that which is here, and the fullness of life, as well as both the creative and destructive elements, which are the dynamic parts. Now, he says, these examples show how difficult it is to distinguish between a sensuous style susceptible of sociological derivation and an imaginative style. And so he talks about he gives examples. He says, the opposition between elementary character and transformative character underlying our exposition is a datum of psychological structure. A combination of opposites is typical for an early period where we designate an Ouroboros as Ouroboros because the Ouroboros, the snake swallowing its tail, is the symbol of the union of opposites in the psychic situation of origination. And so he said, so we saw a similar combination of opposites in a figure of a Thracian goddess. One means by which early man could represent the numinous magnificence and archetypal uniqueness of the feminine consisted in an expressive exaggeration of form and accentuation of the elementary character. Okay, so he is talking about the exaggeration of features in general. Okay, he's not specifically talking about Sheela Na Gigs, but the thing about the Sheela Na Gig is the way in which you see this exaggerated aspect of feminine sexuality and reproduction. He says here the body feeling plays a decisive role. They were the exuberant massive and warmth that emanate from such a figure. The attraction is identical with an unconscious accentuation of the infantile, and for this accent, the goddess is an adequate image of the elementary character of the containment. Okay, so he gets into all of these different ways in which and he talks about what these different interpretations might mean. But the thing here that I find interesting and important here is that these kinds of figures, which are not meant to be mother figures per se, okay? We don't actually know that at all. These could just be figures where when we talk about the ritual idea of anasyrma, I always want to reverse the letters in that for some reason. And we talk about that as something that wards off evil, okay? And interestingly, the fact that this erotic nature, like the erotic power of the great mother, so to speak, is something that can ward off evil. And also the lack of seriousness, the play, the way in which the suffering of life. If you want to think about the devil, okay, if you want to think about the devil in the sense of what the one that brings suffering and torment, right? Which, again, that's another complex image that I won't get into here. But if we look at the devil as the source of torment, okay, let's just go with that idea, which certainly would be a medieval idea. Then the idea is that the woman who does not take, who the one who comes in to torment you and make your life difficult, which does actually, I think, really have kind of a biblical idea, because the role of Satan initially was to, if we look at Job, is to come in and to test you and to challenge you. And to be confronted with this figure who is just showing off their own nakedness. There's a freedom in that, right? There's a freedom in being playful. There's a freedom in saying, if you ever follow, this book came into my mind a couple weeks ago, and I found myself looking at it again. The Principia Discordia, right? The Gospel of Eros. And of course, I think what they usually say for Arisianism is it's a religion disguised as a joke, or a joke disguised as a religion. But there's the idea of, they talk about in this book, and it's a hilarious, like, it's worth looking at, because it's just hilarious in the way it's laid out, especially if you can get a printed copy. I don't know if the copies that are online, unless they're PDFs of the original book, I don't know how well they convey, like with all the images and the forms and the stuff in there that they're just insane. But they're I don't know, but they're provocative too at the same time. But I always talk about the curse of Greyface, the idea that life is a solemn experience to be lived, and that we all of us can't live unless we are all unhappy all the time. And we have to be miserable, and we have to be ashamed of our good feelings, and we have to be ashamed of all of our impulses, all of our joys and stuff. There's going to be somebody who's going to, pour cold water on it, so to speak, to make us feel like we look foolish, or that we're stupid, or we should be ashamed, and all of the things that we end up putting so much of our own spontaneity into shadow, right? So in Discordianism or Arisianism, there's the idea of the turkey curse, they call it. And again, this was written by a bunch of stone guys in the 60s, just so you know. But it was so basically they were saying, you basically stand there, and then you like jump up and down on one leg, and then start flapping your arms and gobbling like a turkey. And they said the effects will be immediately apparent. Because the idea is just that when everybody is so deadly serious, it's like, then there needs to be humor needs to be interjected here. Play needs to be interjected. You ever go to a funeral and stand there, and for some reason you want to be overcome with a fit of laughter? I think Tommy Tiernan actually has a really good routine on this about one of his schoolmates, was it his father who was killed? I think his father had died, and so they were all there in the church, and it was very somber. And there was some woman who went up to get something from the altar, and she tripped. And I forget, whatever it was about the woman, like literally one guy was like, started laughing, and then they were all like trying to hide that they were laughing. And so then they immediately had to pretend that they were crying because they didn't want to look like they were laughing in church at a funeral. But yeah, there's that laughing in the funeral motif. And there may be something in this symbolism. I think even whether it's a fertility symbol, whether it's meant to ward off evil, I mean, it's just almost like the idea that when you kind of embrace, the catonic, the erotic, the sensual, if you embrace who you are and what you are, the corporeal part of yourself, and not treat yourself with the shame of sin, right? And the idea that, somehow your very existence is shameful. And the very fact that you have body parts that do things, that can bring pleasure, They can not bring pleasure too, but they can bring pleasure, and then and potentially can also be a space of creativity. But the idea that you can laugh or that you can behave in a silly or a chaotic way, and that may be part of it too. The idea that somebody can behave outside of the conventions. Throw modesty aside, throw social convention about behavior aside, and just embrace being lewd, right? Being lewd, being outrageous, being funny, being comical. There is there's something of an antidote to that, right? There's something of an effect there that makes us able to not take life so seriously, because that is something that we all do. We all talk about our purpose in life. Even when we're happy, we kind of approach things with a great seriousness. We worry about our accomplishments and, what am I going to do next? And, what am I going to be known for? The whole idea of kleos, even in ancient Greece, the idea I have to be remembered for my deeds. And it's like everybody just taking life very, very seriously instead of just kind of not. And in a way, that's an antidote. It's an antidote to that devil. It's an antidote. And it's that makes the Earth Mother, Demeter as the Earth Mother, and when she's very, very sad about her daughter, actually, and it's interesting because she's sad about Persephone. Really, what we're looking at almost metaphorically here is Persephone entering womanhood, no longer being a young girl. And so it's like, laugh about it. Let's laugh about all of this stuff. Enjoy it. There's something to enjoy in it. There's really no point to this, where it's all here for our enjoyment, for our pleasure. And we take things so seriously, and we take ourselves so seriously. And if there's anything in this, there may be an element, certainly, like I said, on a church, maybe there's an idea of, something that's meant to be instructional about lewdness. But I don't know. The fact that it appears in all these different places, it may be carrying over that ancient connotation, which it is a bit ironic on a church, because certainly it is that worldview that says that we are the product of sin and we are defective, and although the ancient Greeks didn't really have that view. But even so, with ancient Greeks, once you start bringing philosophy into the mix of religion, then religion suddenly becomes this thing that it becomes all about morals and ethics and right behavior. Which, again, nothing wrong with right behavior and morals, but it can be to the point that we then separate ourselves from life. And really, these kinds of outrageous things may be the thing, maybe part of what snaps us back into a state of maybe not taking all of this so seriously. So we don't really know what the Sheela Na Gigs were for. These are all theoretical, and yes, there's some people who tell me, well, why do you bother with speculation? It's all speculation. You know what? What do we need to know for? Why do you need to know? It's interesting to understand the symbolism behind it, especially with regards to what we may unconsciously associate things with, and that's what I think is the important part here. What are your unconscious associations with a lot of this, and what do these represent to us, and what do these represent about the human psyche, and the way the human psyche sees and interprets these things? For all we know, with the Sheela Na Gigs, this could have been, all of those interpretations could be correct at some level. It might not be that you have to pick one. The intention of the person who put it on the church, who the heck knows, or on the castle, but there does seem to be. We're definitely looking something about certainly sensuality, whether it's also fertility. About pleasure, about enjoying life, about being playful, and about not taking things too seriously. Certainly, I would say those elements are there, intended or not, and whether or not that's the reason that they were put on buildings. There's, or what, again, I imagine the greater context of the building might tell you something, and whether or not this was just something they'd seen it elsewhere and decided to put it here. You never know what a symbol is going to represent to people, but even if we assume that these all had some kind of a uniform purpose, certainly that is something that we could take away from it, whatever the intention was of the artists and architects who put them up. So that is it for me this week. Thank you so much for listening. Say thank you again to my patrons. I would not be able to do this without you. This is definitely an artistic labor of love in a lot of ways, with a lot of the stuff that I put out. And so anybody who helps me on Patreon, they're very much appreciated. I do have some new publications out, and I did mention my newest book and my newest books at the beginning of this episode. So if you want to check out catonia.net/publications, you can see all my books. You can also check out the general catonia.net website. All of my work is up there, and when I start offering classes and things, and of course all the podcasts are there as well. There is a Spreaker link there to all of the episodes. I am also on social media. I'm on Catonia Podcast, one word, on Instagram and X, and I say X advisedly because I'm only on there occasionally. But Facebook, it's Catonia Podcast, 2 words, and it's just Catonia on YouTube, although you can do @Catonia Podcast, 1 word, to get the YouTube channel. Thank you guys so much for listening again, and we'll see you in the next episode.